struck me that non-judging would be a good place to start the year, because it's probably one of the most crucial and most misunderstood qualities of mindfulness. It's right there in the definition that is most used. It's John Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness as being the awareness and approach, or the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose, fully present and non-judgmentally. And so this non-judgmentally sometimes seems a little kind of difficult for many people. What does it actually mean, non-judgmental? Why is it there? Like, why does mindfulness, why is mindfulness non-judgmental, or how is it non-judgmental? And one of the keys to this is recognizing that mindfulness is not just a neutral attention. It's not as simple as just seeing what's going on. Mindfulness has qualities of, has certain flavors to it. Willem Kuyken talks about them as being like lenses that kind of, or kind of get tints that are placed on a lens that help us to see in a certain way or with a certain attitude. And so non-judgmentally is one of these ways of seeing the kind of the how of the way that we look, rather than just the kind of bare attention that mindfulness is sometimes caricatured as. Otherwise, if there weren't any qualities of our attention, then mindfulness could be completely lacking in any kind of ethical standpoint or approach. A classic example of this that some people use is of the kind of a sniper looking to kill someone and using attention and being very focused and knowing exactly what's going on and seeing, and then using that to harm. That's not mindfulness. And yet, this word non-judgmental can also sometimes be seen as somehow lacking in lacking in ethical flavor, in that it seems to imply a kind of stepping back and not having any discernment over what's healthy or unhealthy, or skillful or unskillful. And that's not what is meant by non-judging either. It's not enabling abuse to happen in any form, because we're just stepping back and looking and saying, oh, well, that's happening over there and I'm noticing it, so that's mindful. So how do we find a way to understand this where we can be making good decisions, but in a non-judgmental way? We can still have an ethical compass, and yet not be caught in habits of perceiving, maybe not rushing to make decisions, or maybe not always being in a position of knowing immediately what the right thing is. Is it possible that sometimes what we imagine, first of all, to be the right or the wrong thing actually comes from our conditioning rather than from the situation itself? So it's a willingness, this non-judging, to pause, to create a gap between an experience and our reaction to it. And the default mode of the human mind is to separate things, well, actually to separate experiences into things, and to separate things into categories. And those categories might be, that's a phone and it's bad, or this is a poem and it's good. Just seeing the first things I see, and a kind of typical judgment that might arise. And when we do that, there's a quality of fixing something into what we imagine it to be, into a category, into a like or a dislike. And when we fix something like that, then it's very easy for, in some sense, us to kind of sort of lose the multifacetedness of experiences. Those of you who've taken an 8-week mindfulness course will probably remember tasting the raisin in week 1. And you'll generally find that a mindfulness teacher won't use the word raisin while they're guiding the looking and the invitation to smell and to hear, to listen to, and to taste the raisin. They'll call it something like an object. Because as soon as you call something by its name, it's very easy to fix it into a category. Oh, raisins are like that. Poems are like this. Phones are like this. People are like that. That kind of person is like that. You see how we can even kind of start to categorize other human beings as this kind of person, that, he's an angry person. She's an anxious person. Those people over there are like that, etc., etc. And this sort of starts to, even in some way, even perhaps in subtle ways, kind of starts to dehumanize us, both as the perceiver and as the perceived, because we're not categorizable like that. Well, we are, but it doesn't actually reflect who we are, which is much more kind of fluid and flexible and multifaceted. So why do we do this? Well, we tend to categorize those of us with a human mind because it feels safe, because we are likely to be looking out for, is something going to hurt us or help us? And if something is going to hurt us, it might do that quickly. And if we're going to get a benefit from something, maybe we'll need to jump after it. So there's a benefit for us to have these immediate judgments rather than to be pondering for a long time. If you ponder for a long time when an animal's about to jump out of the bushes at you, then you probably won't survive that long. So those immediate judgments have a benefit from an evolutionary perspective, but they're often inaccurate. They're kind of like rough and ready solutions to the problem of the threats that we face. And a lot of the threats that we face aren't these days an animal jumping out of a bush. They're kind of more subtle and perhaps more difficult than that in some ways. Less simple. So judging is safe, or judging feels safe, but it's often inaccurate because it fixes objects, and in some ways fixes ourselves in a way of perceiving that can end up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we think I'm like this, then I'm effectively manifesting being like this. And we can, often the recipients of our judgment, more than anyone else, is actually ourselves. So I'm an untidy person, or I'm useless at maths, or I'll never be happy, or whatever. You can fill in your own blanks. It kind of fixes in an idea, and each of those ideas are judgments about who we think we are, rather than the recognition that we're fluid, changing experiences, and we're kind of on a journey of evolution through life, which is good news, because it means we are changing as much as we might like to think of ourselves. Of course, we have tendencies and patterns that re-emerge, but actually, if I have the idea, I'm useless at maths, that makes it seem unchangeable, whereas actually most skills can be practiced, including the skills of mathematics. So we expand our perception when we're willing to open up to non-judging as a way of meeting experience. And that requires us to pause, requires us to stop, to take a step back in order to see the whole rather than just the separated parts in which we've kind of made through habit. And it's difficult because it means we have to, we are invited to do the labor of looking, to really see as much as we can someone in their fullness, or something in its fullness. That raisin exercise that some of you will have engaged with, we spend a lot longer looking at that raisin, tasting the raisin, smelling the raisin than we might usually do, where it's just and it goes. But that's the point. It's difficult and it's challenging, but it's also, people often find hugely rewarding, because we start to find that our world is not just black and white. Black and white in the sense of the judging, is it this or is it that? Is it black or is it white? But also in the sense of, just kind of lacking color. Whereas when we choose to stop and look with a suspension of judgment, not to say that, our discernments are never needed, but to suspend temporarily, then we can maybe, what we often find is that the world starts to fill with color again. The raisin becomes not just a word, but a multifaceted object with lots of aspects to it, as might the phone or the poem or me or you or that person over there, whoever they happen to be. That technicolor is rather wonderful, but it does take a continuing effort to drop out of and to recognize the autopilot of judge, 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 separate, separate, because it feels safer. So maybe we're more likely to find wise responses if we step back and look, when that's possible. And I'm not, by the way, suggesting that when you're faced with a dangerous animal that you stop and look at it with curiosity and investigate with interest while it attacks you. Of course, there are great benefits to having this capacity to separate, but it's just that it's not helpful all the time. In fact, it's not helpful that much of the time. We might also, in a non-judging way, be more interested in what's going on for other people, when our tendency might be to, if you like, dismiss them with a category or a judgment. Recognizing actually, oh, maybe that person is because they're human, they are just like me, with their frailties and their vulnerabilities and their strengths and their wisdom, and we might be more forgiving of their patterns and the ways that they might irritate us by not acting the way that we want them to act, or believing the things that we think they should believe. It might be a really valuable skill to have in this world, where there seems to be some kind of heightened polarization in many areas of our life. Whether that's in politics or in healthcare or in education or in family life, being neighbors, seeing the humanity in each other, including ourselves, might create the possibility of a communication that's not black and white, but that recognizes the nuances that are actually part of all of these thorny subjects that we can get exercised by. And some of you might be familiar with the work of Marshall Rosenberg, who wrote a book called Nonviolent Communication, and developed a whole method of communicating in a way that is non-judgmental. And he was very specific about saying it's the judgments that lead to kind of frustration in communication. But if we can pause, and he talked about observing as being the first step, and then feeling as the second step. So actually noticing what we're feeling. And then the third quality, or one of the third qualities, being empathy, connecting, actually being willing to put oneself in the other person's shoes. And if we've got those qualities, and then willing to recognize that actually we're all human beings with needs that are actually life-affirming, we all want to be happy, then there's the possibility of finding some common ground It's really interesting to me because he talks about observation and feeling and empathy and connection, and yet there's no mention of mindfulness anywhere, or meditation, and yet it's those exact same qualities that we talk about in mindfulness training that he seemed to find effective in helping parties who were really like, I mean, we're talking about like groups at war, perhaps, or really, really polarized situations that he would go into and ask people to connect through observing and feeling and hearing each other without necessarily trying to push for a solution. And in mindfulness training, we have some methods to help us to actually practice that way of observing, which of course is noticing, of tapping into feeling tone, which we do when we drop into the senses, and connecting with empathy with ourselves and by consequence with each other as we practice together.